The coffee shop was buzzing with its usual morning rush when Blake walked in with his venture capitalist friends, their loud conversation about unicorn startups and Series B funding cutting through the gentle hum of espresso machines. I was behind the counter at Grind Coffee, the same spot I'd held for 3 years while secretly building what would become the foundation of Blake's empire. He ordered his usual oat milk cortado without making eye contact, treating me like furniture in front of his colleagues. What happened next would expose the biggest lie in Silicon Valley and destroy everything he thought he'd built. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The steam wand hissed as I crafted Blake's cortado to perfection, the same drink I'd been making for him since we started dating 8 months ago. Back then, he'd lingered at the counter, charmed by what he called my authentic downtown energy, and fascinated by the fact that I chose to work at an independent coffee shop instead of chasing corporate dreams like everyone else in Seattle's tech scene. Those early conversations had been intoxicating, filled with his grand visions of disrupting industries and changing the world through technology. Now, as I slid his drink across the marble counter, Blake barely glanced up from his animated discussion about market penetration strategies. His friends, 3 men in identical Patagonia vests and artfully distressed jeans, were deep into dissecting the success of his app StreamlineSync, which had just crossed the million-user milestone and secured $8 million in Series A funding. I'd read about it in TechCrunch the week before, the article praising Blake Morrison as a visionary founder who'd revolutionized project management for creative teams. The beauty of StreamlineSync, Blake was explaining to his captivated audience, is its intuitive interface design. Most project management tools are built by engineers for engineers, but I understood that creative professionals needed something more elegant, more visual. He gestured expansively, his voice carrying that particular Silicon Valley blend of confidence and condescension. The user experience flow I created is what really sets it apart from competitors like Asana or Monday.com. I felt a familiar twist in my stomach as I listened to him claim credit for work I'd poured my heart into during countless late nights in my tiny Capitol Hill apartment. The intuitive interface he was bragging about had been born from my frustration with clunky project management systems during my previous job at a design agency. The elegant visual hierarchy had emerged from my background in both computer science and user experience design, fields I'd studied obsessively while working my way through University of Washington. Maya. Cortado for Blake, I called out, using the professional tone I'd perfected for difficult customers. Blake approached the counter, his friends trailing behind, their conversation never pausing. Actually, one of his companions said, a man with perfectly styled silver hair and an expensive watch. I'd love to hear more about your development process. The technical architecture behind StreamlineSync is impressive. Did you build the entire backend yourself? Blake's hand froze momentarily as he reached for his drink, and I caught a flicker of something uncomfortable in his expression before he recovered. Well, I had some help with the initial coding phases, he said carefully. But the core vision, the product strategy, the user experience architecture, that was all me. You know how it is in early-stage startups? Sometimes you have to outsource certain technical tasks to focus on the big picture. I busied myself wiping down the espresso machine, my movements becoming more aggressive with each word. Outsource. Technical tasks. The dismissiveness in his voice made my chest burn with suppressed anger. What he was describing as outsourcing had been our collaboration. Or what I'd thought was collaboration. Those late nights when he'd come over to my apartment, supposedly to spend time together, had often turned into impromptu design sessions, where I'd sketch out user interface mock-ups while he paced my living room, throwing out half-formed ideas about functionality. The real genius, Blake continued, warming to his subject, was understanding that creatives don't think linearly. Traditional project management assumes a waterfall approach, but creative work is iterative, cyclical. You need a tool that accommodates multiple concurrent workflows while maintaining visual clarity about deadlines and dependencies. Everything he was saying came directly from conversations we'd had during those development sessions. I remembered the exact night he'd struggled to articulate why existing tools felt wrong for creative teams. I'd pulled out my laptop and shown him my personal project management system, a collection of interconnected dashboards I'd built to organize my freelance design work and coding projects. The visual metaphor of a creative workspace with multiple active projects, each in different phases, had been my suggestion. The dependency mapping that allowed teams to see how delays in one area would ripple through other deliverables had been my innovation. The silver-haired investor was nodding appreciatively. The market validation is certainly there. 8 million in funding and 1 million users in 18 months? 16 months from initial concept to Series A, Blake corrected with obvious pride, though the actual development phase was much shorter. About 6 months from wireframes to beta launch. 6 months. I remembered those 6 months with crystal clarity because they'd been the most intense period of my life. While maintaining my full-time schedule at Grind Coffee, I'd been coding StreamlineSync's entire back-end architecture, designing its user interface, and debugging its complex algorithmic systems. Blake had told me it was our secret project, something we were building together that would eventually fund our future. He'd painted visions of us as co-founders, partners in both business and life, revolutionizing how creative teams worked. The front-end framework I'd chosen, React with TypeScript, had been selected specifically for its scalability and maintainability. The back-end API, built-in Node. JS with a PostgreSQL database had been architected to handle millions of users from day one. The real-time collaboration features that made StreamlineSync special, allowing team members to see each other's changes instantly, had required implementing WebSocket connections and conflict resolution algorithms that had taken me weeks to perfect. Maya, could I get a refill on this? A regular customer interrupted my increasingly dark thoughts, holding up an empty mug. I smiled and moved to the coffee station, grateful for the distraction from Blake's performance. As I poured fresh coffee, I overheard more of the conversation. The thing about StreamlineSync that really impresses me, one of Blake's friends was saying, is how it handles complex team hierarchies. Most tools either oversimplify permissions or make them so granular they become unusable. Your role-based access system is elegant. I nearly dropped the coffee pot. The role-based access system had been one of my proudest technical achievements. Traditional project management tools treated permissions as binary, all-or-nothing propositions, but creative teams needed nuanced access controls. A freelance designer might need full access to visual assets, but limited access to budget information. A client might need to approve final deliverables, but shouldn't see internal team discussions. Building a permission system that felt intuitive while remaining completely secure had required developing my own authorization framework from scratch. Thanks, Blake was saying, his voice carrying that particular note of false modesty that successful founders perfected. I spent a lot of time thinking about the enterprise sales angle from the beginning. You can't just build for individual users anymore. You need to consider how the product scales within organizations. Enterprise sales. I remembered when Blake had first mentioned wanting to target bigger clients. I'd been the one to research enterprise software requirements, to understand compliance needs like SOC 2 certification and GDPR compatibility. I'd built the audit logging system that tracked every user action, the data encryption protocols that protected sensitive information, the backup systems that ensured no project data could ever be lost.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The enterprise features that were now generating StreamlineSync's recurring revenue had been my response to Blake's casual comment that maybe we should think bigger. The morning rush was beginning to wind down, giving me more mental space to focus on their conversation. Blake was now explaining his go-to-market strategy, how he'd identified the gap in the creative project management space and positioned StreamlineSync to fill it. He talked about user acquisition costs and lifetime value metrics, about the freemium model that converted free users to paid subscriptions, about the viral growth loops that had driven organic adoption. Every strategy he was describing had emerged from our late-night discussions. I'd been the one researching competitor pricing models, analyzing user reviews to identify pain points, mapping out customer acquisition funnels. The freemium model had been my suggestion, based on my analysis of how creative teams actually made software purchasing decisions. Small agencies and freelancers needed to test functionality thoroughly before committing to paid plans. But once they experienced StreamlineSync's advanced features, conversion rates were high. The viral growth mechanisms had been particularly challenging to implement. I'd built referral systems that rewarded users for inviting team members, notification systems that kept projects visible across team communication channels, and integration APIs that allowed StreamlineSync to connect with other tools creative teams used daily. The technical complexity of making these systems work seamlessly while maintaining performance had required months of optimization. The user onboarding flow is what really drives adoption, Blake was explaining. Most B2B software has terrible onboarding, just dumps users into a complex interface and expects them to figure it out. But I designed an interactive tutorial that walks users through creating their first project, inviting team members, and setting up their first workflow. The completion rate is over 80%. I bit my lip hard enough to taste blood. The onboarding flow had been inspired by my frustration watching new baristas struggle to learn our coffee shop's point-of-sale system. Good software should feel intuitive from the first interaction, guiding users naturally toward success rather than overwhelming them with options. I'd sketched out the entire onboarding sequence on napkins during slow afternoon shifts, then spent evenings coding the interactive tutorials and progress indicators that made complex project setup feel simple. The psychological principles behind the onboarding design had come from my personal study of user experience research. I'd read dozens of academic papers on cognitive load theory, on the importance of progressive disclosure in interface design, on how small, early wins could build user confidence and engagement. The celebratory animations that played when users completed onboarding steps, the contextual help bubbles that appeared just when users needed guidance, the smart defaults that made initial project creation nearly effortless. All of it had been carefully crafted based on behavioral psychology research. User retention is the real metric that matters, one of Blake's friends observed. How's your churn rate looking? Industry leading, Blake replied without hesitation. Under 5% monthly churn for paid accounts. Once teams integrate StreamlineSync into their workflow, they can't imagine working without it. The switching costs become prohibitive because their entire project history and team communication is locked into the platform. The low churn rate was something I'd obsessed over during development. I'd built comprehensive data export tools so users never felt trapped. But I'd also designed the system to become more valuable over time. The more projects teams completed within StreamlineSync, the more historical data they accumulated. The project templates feature learned from past successful projects, automatically suggesting timelines and resource allocation based on similar previous work. The team performance analytics helped managers identify bottlenecks and optimize their processes. The integration ecosystem meant StreamlineSync became the central hub connecting all their other tools. I'd spent weeks studying why users abandoned project management software. The research showed that most tools failed because they required too much manual input without providing enough value in return. People would start enthusiastically, create a few projects, then gradually stop updating them as real work took priority. StreamlineSync solved this through intelligent automation that reduced manual overhead while increasing utility. Task status updates could be pulled automatically from connected tools like GitHub or Figma. Time tracking happened passively through integration with calendar apps and communication platforms. Progress reports generated themselves based on completed deliverables and milestone achievements. The conversation had shifted to discussing Blake's next funding round. With these metrics, you should be able to raise a significant Series B, the silver-haired investor was saying. Probably looking at a 50 to 100 million valuation range, depending on growth trajectory. That's the plan, Blake confirmed. We're projecting 3x growth over the next 18 months. The product roadmap is pretty aggressive, but I'm confident we can execute. The foundation is solid, and the market opportunity is massive. The product roadmap. I wondered if he meant the detailed feature development plan I'd created, complete with technical specifications and implementation timelines. After the initial launch, Blake had asked me to map out potential enhancements based on user feedback and competitive analysis. I'd proposed advanced AI features that could predict project delays based on historical patterns, automated resource optimization that could suggest better team allocation, and predictive analytics that could help agencies price projects more accurately. The AI features had been particularly exciting to research. I'd experimented with machine learning models that could analyze thousands of completed projects, to identify patterns that predicted success or failure. The early prototypes could spot warning signs like scope creep or resource conflicts weeks before they would typically become visible to project managers. The potential to help creative teams avoid common pitfalls through data-driven insights had felt like a genuine innovation, not just another incremental improvement to existing tools. Blake's phone buzzed and he glanced at it with an apologetic smile. "Sorry guys, I need to take this call. Pre-meeting for our Series B pitch next week." He stepped away from the counter, phone pressed to his ear, leaving his friends to continue their conversation without him. "Blake's really built something special here," one of them was saying. "You don't see technical founders with his level of business acumen very often. Usually it's one or the other." Technical founder. The phrase echoed in my mind as I mechanically prepared drinks for other customers. Blake's technical background consisted of a business degree from Stanford and a brief stint at a management consulting firm. During our early conversations, he'd admitted that coding intimidated him, that he preferred to focus on strategy and vision while leaving implementation to others. That admission had been part of what drew me to collaborate with him. I'd thought we were building something together, combining my technical skills with his business instincts. But sitting in investor meetings, he'd apparently transformed into a technical visionary who'd single-handedly architected a complex software platform. The disconnect between the Blake I knew privately and the Blake performing for potential investors was jarring. In private, he often asked me to explain basic programming concepts, to help him understand why certain features would be difficult to implement, or why some user requests weren't technically feasible. Yet in public, he spoke with authority about technical architecture and development processes. The cognitive dissonance was making me increasingly uncomfortable as the morning wore on. I'd been telling myself that our arrangement was temporary, that once StreamlineSync gained traction, Blake would publicly acknowledge my contributions, and we'd formalize our partnership. He'd hinted at equity sharing, at bringing me on as co-founder once they had proper funding. But listening to him claim complete credit for work I'd poured my soul into, I was beginning to question whether those promises had ever been genuine. My shift supervisor Emma approached the counter, her expression concerned. "Maya, you okay? You look like you're about to murder someone." I forced a smile and lowered my voice. "Just tired, didn't sleep well last night." Emma glanced toward Blake's group, then back at me with a knowing look. She'd been working at Grind Coffee longer than anyone and had observed the evolution of my relationship with Blake. In the early days, she'd teased me about my regular customer who lingered after closing time to walk me home. Lately, she'd made subtle comments about how distracted I seemed whenever Blake was around. "Want to take your break early?" she offered. "I can cover the espresso machine." I nodded gratefully and untied my apron. The break room was a cramped space behind the kitchen, furnished with a single table and mismatched chairs. I pulled out my phone and opened StreamlineSync's website, something I'd been avoiding for weeks. The homepage featured a sleek video showcasing the platform's features, with Blake's photograph prominently displayed above his founder biography. Blake Morrison founded StreamlineSync after recognizing the unique project management challenges facing creative teams, the bio read. Drawing on his experience in business strategy and his passion for elegant software design, Blake built StreamlineSync from the ground up to serve the specific needs of agencies, design studios, and creative freelancers. Under his leadership, StreamlineSync has grown from concept to million-user platform in just 16 months. From concept to million-user platform in 16 months. The timeline was accurate, but the story was a complete fabrication. Blake hadn't built anything from the ground up. He'd provided high-level direction and business strategy while I'd handled every aspect of technical implementation. The experience in elegant software design was mine, earned through years of freelance work and personal projects. The passion for serving creative teams' needs came from my own frustration with inadequate tools during my time at the design agency. I scrolled through the team page, looking for any mention of my contributions. The engineering section listed 3 developers who'd been hired after the initial launch, all male, all credited with enhancing and scaling Blake's original codebase. There was no acknowledgement of the fact that the original codebase had been written entirely by someone else, someone whose name appeared nowhere on the website. The press coverage was even more painful to read. Article after article described Blake as a technical founder who'd identified a market gap and built an innovative solution. TechCrunch had called him a rare combination of technical depth and business savvy. Forbes had included him in their quote, for under 30 inches list for enterprise technology. The Seattle Times had featured him in a profile about local tech entrepreneurs, complete with a photo of him working intently at a laptop in what appeared to be his home office. That photo particularly stung because I recognized the desk. It was the standing desk in his apartment, where I'd spent countless hours debugging complex algorithmic problems while he worked on business development activities. The laptop in the photo was likely displaying code I'd written, problems I'd solved, architecture I'd designed, yet the narrative presented him as the solitary genius responsible for StreamlineSync's technical innovation. The worst part was reading user testimonials about how StreamlineSync had transformed their businesses. Creative teams describing how the platform had streamlined their workflows, eliminated communication bottlenecks, and helped them deliver better work for their clients. These stories should have filled me with pride and satisfaction. Instead, they felt like a constant reminder that my contributions had been erased from the narrative, my work attributed to someone else. I closed the browser and leaned back in the uncomfortable break room chair, trying to process the growing realization that I'd been systematically excluded from something I'd built. The collaborative partnership I'd believed in was apparently a fiction. Blake had positioned himself as the sole creator of StreamlineSync while relegating me to the role of anonymous contractor, despite the fact that the vast majority of the platform's code, design, and innovative features had originated from my work. The break room door opened and Emma peeked in. "Hey, your boyfriend's friends are asking if you make custom latte art. Something about a company logo for their meeting?" I stood up slowly, straightening my barista apron. "Tell them I'll be right there." Walking back to the counter, I observed Blake's group with new eyes. They were discussing StreamlineSync's competitive advantages, analyzing how Blake had positioned the product to capture market share from established players. The conversation had moved to technical differentiation, with Blake explaining how StreamlineSync's real-time collaboration features created network effects that increased user engagement. Network effects. The concept wasn't wrong, but Blake's understanding of the implementation was surface level at best. The real-time collaboration system had required building a complex operational transformation algorithm that could handle multiple users editing the same project simultaneously without creating conflicts. Traditional approaches like simple last write wins would have resulted in lost data and frustrated users. Instead, I'd implemented a sophisticated conflict resolution system that tracked changes at a granular level and merged concurrent edits intelligently. The technical challenge had been enormous. Every user action, from updating task status to commenting on deliverables, had to be synchronized across all connected clients in real time while maintaining data consistency. The system needed to handle network interruptions gracefully, queue updates when users were offline, and resolve conflicts when the same data was modified by multiple people simultaneously. The mathematical complexity of the operational transformation algorithms had required weeks of research into academic computer science literature. But listening to Blake explain it to investors, the technical implementation sounded trivial, something any competent developer could have built over a weekend. The complexity was hidden behind his casual confidence, his ability to make revolutionary features sound like obvious solutions to straightforward problems. His talent wasn't in building technology. It was in making complex technology sound simple and inevitable. "Maya, they'd like you to create a StreamlineSync logo in their lattes," Emma said quietly as I returned to the espresso machine. I looked across the counter at Blake's group, all of them watching me expectantly. Blake himself was back from his phone call, standing slightly apart from his friends with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was something in his eyes that might have been pride, or possession, or perhaps just the satisfied confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Of course," I said, pulling 3 cups from the stack and beginning to steam milk. "I'd be happy to create custom latte art for you." As I worked, carefully controlling the milk foam to create the StreamlineSync logo I designed myself months ago, I felt a strange sense of detachment. Here I was, being asked to recreate my own logo by people who had no idea I'd created it. The irony was so perfect, it felt almost scripted, like a scene from a movie about corporate deception and hidden genius. The logo itself had gone through dozens of iterations before I'd settled on the final design. It needed to convey organization and creativity simultaneously, to appeal to both project managers who valued efficiency and creative professionals who prioritized aesthetics. The interlocking circles represented different project phases flowing seamlessly into each other, while the gradient color scheme suggested dynamic progress and innovation. The typography was custom, designed to feel both professional and approachable. I finished the first latte and slid it across the counter to the silver-haired investor. He examined the foam art appreciatively, pulling out his phone to take a photo. "This is incredible detail work. You're quite talented." "Thank you," I replied, beginning work on the second cup. "I enjoy creating things that people appreciate." Blake stepped closer to the counter, watching me work. "Maya's been making my drinks for months," he said to his friends. "She has a real eye for design. A real eye for design." The casual dismissiveness in his tone made me press my lips together to avoid saying something I'd regret. A real eye for design barely scratched the surface of the years I'd spent studying user experience principles, the countless hours I'd invested in understanding how visual hierarchy affected user behavior, the sophisticated understanding of information architecture that had made StreamlineSync's interface so intuitive. "Do you do other design work?" one of his friends asked. "Freelance projects, maybe?" I felt Blake's attention sharpen, his body language becoming more alert as he waited for my response. This was dangerous territory, I realized. He couldn't risk me mentioning any connection to StreamlineSync, but he also couldn't appear to be controlling what I said without raising questions. "Some freelance projects," I answered carefully, "mostly helping small businesses with branding and web design. Nothing too exciting." The lie felt bitter in my mouth, but I wasn't ready for the confrontation that honesty would provoke. Not here, not now, not without a plan for what would come next. If I was going to expose Blake's deception, I needed to do it strategically, with evidence and preparation, not as an emotional outburst over coffee. I completed the remaining lattes, each one featuring the StreamlineSync logo rendered in milk foam with precise detail. Blake's friends were clearly impressed, taking photos and discussing the quality of the work. The silver-haired investor mentioned wanting to hire me for an upcoming corporate event, asking for my contact information. "Maya doesn't really do commercial work," Blake interjected quickly. "She prefers to keep her art more personal, more authentic. Right, Maya?" The presumption in his voice, the way he answered for me without consultation, sparked something hot and angry in my chest. But I simply nodded and handed over the final latte, maintaining the professional smile I'd perfected during 3 years of customer service. As Blake's group prepared to leave, discussing their next meeting and the upcoming Series B pitch, I felt a profound shift in my understanding of our relationship. The collaboration I'd believed in, the partnership I'd hoped for, the shared future we'd discussed, all of it had been an elaborate manipulation designed to extract my labor, while ensuring I received no credit or compensation. Blake lingered at the counter after his friends had moved toward the exit. "Great work with the latte art," he said quietly. "You always know how to make things look perfect." Perfect. The word echoed strangely, carrying implications I was only beginning to understand. Perfect for whom? Perfect for what purpose? I'd been making things perfect for Blake for months, pouring my creativity and technical expertise into his vision, making his success possible while remaining invisible in the narrative. "Thanks," I replied, my voice neutral. "I hope your meeting goes well." He smiled, the same charming expression that had initially attracted me to him. "It will. Everything's coming together exactly as planned." Everything's coming together exactly as planned. As I watched him walk away, rejoining his friends for their next appointment, I wondered if I'd ever been more than a component in his plan, a resource to be utilized and then discarded once it was no longer needed. The possibility that our entire relationship had been calculated, that his initial interest in me had been motivated by my technical skills rather than genuine attraction, was too painful to fully consider. But I was beginning to suspect that everything I'd believed about Blake Morrison was as carefully constructed as the StreamlineSync platform itself. The difference was that I'd built the platform honestly, with genuine innovation and technical excellence. Blake had built his public persona through deception, appropriating my work and presenting it as his own vision. The morning rush had ended, leaving the coffee shop quiet except for a few customers working on laptops in the corner booths. I mechanically cleaned the espresso machine and restocked supplies, my mind racing through possibilities and implications. If Blake was willing to claim complete credit for StreamlineSync in front of investors, what did that mean for any future acknowledgement of my contributions? If he was already positioning himself as the technical founder for Series B funding, how much harder would it become to correct the narrative later? Emma approached with the register drawer for the morning cash count. Everything okay? You seem really distracted today. I considered how much to tell her. Emma had become a good friend during my time at Grind Coffee, someone I trusted with personal details about my life outside work. She knew I'd been doing freelance design projects, and she'd observed my relationship with Blake evolve from casual dating to something more serious. But she didn't know about StreamlineSync, about the months of secret development work, about the growing realization that I'd been systematically excluded from something I'd created. Just thinking about some work stuff, I said finally, trying to figure out my next steps. Emma studied my expression with the perceptive eye of someone who'd spent years reading customers' moods. Work stuff related to a certain regular customer who orders oat milk cortados? The question was gentle but pointed. Emma had clearly noticed the tension in my interaction with Blake's group, the way I'd responded to their conversation about StreamlineSync. I wondered how much she'd overheard, how obvious my discomfort had become. Maybe, I admitted. It's complicated. Complicated how? Like, relationship complicated or something else? I paused, considering how to articulate the situation without revealing too much. What would you do if someone took credit for work you'd done? Like, completely took credit, told everyone it was their idea and their effort? Emma's expression darkened immediately. That's theft. Intellectual property theft, specifically. Are we talking about design work? Did someone steal your freelance projects? The accuracy of her assessment was startling. Emma had studied business administration before deciding she preferred the coffee industry, and she understood intellectual property concepts better than most baristas. Her immediate recognition that credit theft was a serious issue validated my growing anger about Blake's behavior. Something like that, I said carefully. I'm just trying to figure out what my options are. Document everything, Emma advised without hesitation. Every email, every file, every piece of evidence that proves the work was yours. Then talk to a lawyer who specializes in intellectual property. Don't wait. Don't give them time to cover their tracks or create alternative explanations. The advice was practical and urgent, reflecting the seriousness of the situation. If I was going to challenge Blake's narrative about StreamlineSync, I needed to act quickly and strategically. The longer I waited, the more established his version of events would become, and the harder it would be to prove my contributions. Thanks, I said, meaning it. That's really helpful advice. Emma squeezed my shoulder supportively. Whatever happened, don't let anyone take credit for your work. You're too talented and too smart to be someone else's ghost contributor. Ghost contributor. The phrase perfectly captured my role in StreamlineSync's development. I'd been the invisible technical founder, the unnamed architect behind Blake's public success. But ghosts, I reflected, had a way of making their presence known when the time was right. The rest of my shift passed in a blur of routine tasks and racing thoughts. I served regular customers, cleaned equipment, and restocked inventory while my mind churned through everything I'd observed and overheard. Blake's performance for his investor friends had revealed the full scope of his deception, the complete appropriation of my work for his personal gain. By closing time, I'd reached a decision. I couldn't continue pretending our collaboration was legitimate, while he claimed sole credit for everything I'd built. The time had come to document my contributions, gather evidence of my role in creating StreamlineSync, and decide how to reclaim credit for my own work. Walking home through Capitol Hill's tree-lined streets, I felt a strange mix of anger and anticipation. Email after email contained phrases like, quote, "When you finish implementing the user authentication system," and "once you've completed the dashboard redesign," And your back-end optimization suggestions make perfect sense. I pulled up our text message history, scrolling back to the early development period. The conversations painted a clear picture of our actual working relationship. Blake would describe a business requirement or user need, often in vague terms, and I would respond with detailed technical solutions and implementation plans. Our exchanges showed him asking questions about how certain features worked, requesting explanations of technical concepts, and expressing amazement at functionality I'd built. One particularly revealing conversation had occurred during the development of StreamlineSync's AI-powered project timeline prediction feature. Blake had texted me after a customer discovery call, excited about the potential for machine learning to help creative teams estimate project durations more accurately. My response had been a detailed explanation of the natural language processing algorithms I could implement to analyze project descriptions and historical data to generate timeline recommendations. The feature had taken me 3 weeks to build, requiring integration with multiple machine learning libraries and training datasets I'd assembled from public project management databases. Blake's contribution had been suggesting that accurate timeline estimation would be valuable for creative teams. Yet in every public discussion of the feature, he described it as his breakthrough insight into applying artificial intelligence to creative project management. I photographed each page of evidence with my phone, creating digital backups of the physical documentation. The process was tedious but necessary. If I was going to challenge Blake's narrative publicly, I needed irrefutable proof of my contributions. His word against mine wouldn't be sufficient, especially given his established reputation in the Seattle tech community and my complete absence from the public record. The doorbell interrupted my documentation process. I glanced at the security camera feed on my phone, recognizing my neighbor Jessica from across the hall. Jessica worked as a patent attorney at a downtown firm, and we'd developed a friendship based on our shared experience of being young professional women in male-dominated fields. Her legal expertise had been invaluable during my freelance career, helping me understand intellectual property protections and contract negotiations. "Hey, Maya," Jessica said when I opened the door, holding 2 cups of takeout coffee. "I was grabbing dinner and thought you might want some caffeine. You look like you're working on something intense." I accepted the coffee gratefully, realizing I'd been so focused on documentation that I'd forgotten to eat. "Thanks. This is perfect timing. I'm dealing with a complicated situation and could actually use some legal perspective." Jessica followed me into the apartment, her eyes widening as she surveyed the organized chaos covering my floor. As a patent attorney, she was accustomed to reviewing technical documentation and immediately recognized the systematic nature of my evidence collection. "This looks like preparation for litigation," she observed, settling carefully among the papers. "What kind of situation are we talking about?" I explained the StreamlineSync situation carefully, walking through Blake's appropriation of my work and his public claims of sole authorship. Jessica listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions about our working relationship and the extent of my technical contributions. Her expression grew increasingly serious as I detailed the scope of Blake's deception. "Maya, this is substantial intellectual property theft," she said when I finished explaining. "What you're describing could support claims for copyright infringement, trade secret misappropriation, and potentially fraud, depending on how he's representing the situation to investors." The legal terminology made the situation feel more real and more serious. I'd been thinking about Blake's behavior as betrayal and deception, but Jessica's analysis highlighted the criminal dimensions of his actions. Claiming false authorship of copyrighted software code wasn't just unethical, it was potentially illegal. What kind of evidence would I need to prove my claims? I asked, gesturing to the materials spread around us. Jessica picked up one of my development notebooks, examining the detailed technical diagrams and dated entries. "This is actually excellent documentation. The contemporaneous notes, especially with dates and technical details, carry significant legal weight. But the strongest evidence would be the source code repository with commit history and timestamps." I pulled up the GitHub repository on my laptop, showing her the comprehensive commit history spanning the entire development period. Each commit included timestamps, code changes, and descriptive messages that documented my thought process and implementation decisions. The repository contained over 200 commits, representing hundreds of hours of development work. This is compelling evidence, Jessica said, scrolling through the commit history. The timestamps and technical complexity would be difficult for someone to fabricate after the fact. But I need to ask some difficult questions about your relationship with Blake and any potential claims he might make about your contributions. We spent the next hour discussing the nuances of intellectual property law as it applied to collaborative software development. Jessica explained concepts like work-for-hire agreements, joint authorship claims, and the importance of proving independent creation versus derivative work. The legal landscape was complex, but the fundamental question was straightforward. Who had actually created the intellectual property that became StreamlineSync? The challenge you're facing, Jessica explained, is that Blake has established a public narrative about his role as founder and technical creator. Challenging that narrative will require not just proving your contributions, but also demonstrating that his claims are false. You'll need to show that he couldn't have created what he's claiming to have created. The distinction was important. It wasn't enough to prove that I'd contributed to StreamlineSync's development. I needed to demonstrate that Blake's technical claims were fabricated. This would require analyzing his actual technical knowledge and comparing it to the complexity of the code I'd written. Do you have any recordings of conversations where he admits to not understanding the technical implementation? Jessica asked. I thought about our private discussions, remembering numerous occasions when Blake had asked me to explain how specific features worked or why certain technical decisions had been necessary. Unfortunately, those conversations had occurred in person or over phone calls, leaving no recorded evidence of his admitted technical limitations. Nothing recorded, I admitted, but I have emails where he asks me to explain technical concepts and implementation details. Would those be useful? Jessica nodded enthusiastically. Absolutely. If you can demonstrate a pattern of him seeking technical explanations from you, it supports your claim that he lacks the expertise to have created what he's claiming credit for. We identified several categories of evidence that would strengthen my case: technical documentation proving my authorship, communications demonstrating Blake's reliance on my expertise, timeline evidence showing when different features were actually developed, and comparative analysis of Blake's public technical claims versus his private admissions of limited technical knowledge. The most powerful evidence would be demonstrating that Blake couldn't reproduce or explain the technical decisions embedded in the StreamlineSync codebase. The architecture I'd created included sophisticated solutions to complex engineering problems. Someone who had actually designed and implemented those solutions would be able to explain the reasoning behind specific technical choices. Someone who had merely observed the final product would struggle to articulate why certain approaches had been selected over alternatives. Your strongest legal strategy, Jessica advised, would be to formally document your intellectual property claims before taking any public action. File copyright registrations for the source code, create dated technical specifications, and establish a clear timeline of creation that predates any of Blake's public claims. The advice was practical and urgent. Every day that passed allowed Blake to further establish his false narrative while potentially making it harder for me to prove my contributions. The tech industry moved quickly, and reputations could be cemented or destroyed based on perception as much as reality. After Jessica left, I continued organizing evidence until well past midnight. The process was emotionally exhausting, forcing me to relive months of collaboration I'd believed was genuine partnership. Each email, each code commit, each technical diagram represented hours of my life invested in what I'd thought was our shared future. The most painful discovery was a series of emails from the period just before StreamlineSync's public launch. Blake had been preparing for press interviews and investor presentations, and his messages to me had focused on ensuring I wouldn't inadvertently contradict his narrative about the product's development. He'd never explicitly asked me to lie, but the implications had been clear. My role should remain invisible, while his public persona as technical founder took center stage. Reading those emails now, I realized how gradually and systematically Blake had marginalized my contributions. The process had been so subtle that I'd barely noticed it happening. Initial discussions about "we built this together" had evolved into "I built this with some technical assistance," and finally into "I built this." My role had been edited out of the story so smoothly that I'd almost convinced myself it was natural, The next morning, I called in sick to work at Grind Coffee. Emma was understanding when I explained that I needed to handle some urgent personal business, and she assured me that my shifts would be covered without any problems. The flexibility was one of the advantages of working at an independent coffee shop rather than a corporate chain. Emma trusted her employees to manage their own responsibilities professionally. My first stop was the downtown office of the United States Copyright Office's Regional Processing Center. Jessica had explained that while copyright protection existed automatically when I created the source code, formal registration would provide additional legal protections and establish an official record of my authorship claims. The process was straightforward but time-consuming, requiring detailed documentation of the copyrighted material and sworn statements about its creation. The copyright registration forms asked for comprehensive information about the work's creation, including dates of completion, previous publication history, and details about any collaborative contributions. I carefully documented my sole authorship of the StreamlineSync codebase, while noting that the software had been published under Blake Morrison's name without my authorization. The legal language felt strange and formal, transforming my personal betrayal into official claims of intellectual property theft. After completing the copyright paperwork, one visited a notary public to create sworn affidavits documenting my role in StreamlineSync's development. The affidavits included detailed technical descriptions of my contributions, timeline documentation of the development process, and statements about Blake's misrepresentation of authorship. The notarized documents would carry legal weight in any future proceedings while establishing an official record of my claims. The most important stop was a meeting with David Chen, an intellectual property attorney whom Jessica had recommended. David specialized in software copyright cases and had experience with disputes involving misattributed authorship in tech startups. His office was located in a gleaming downtown tower, surrounded by other law firms that served Seattle's thriving technology sector. David reviewed my documentation with the focused attention of someone accustomed to complex technical evidence. He examined the source code repository, read through my development notebooks, and analyzed the email communications between Blake and me. His questions were precise and thorough, probing potential weaknesses in my claims while identifying the strongest elements of my case. This is one of the most well-documented intellectual property theft cases I've seen, David said after reviewing the evidence. The second phase would present Blake with irrefutable evidence and demand formal acknowledgement of my contributions. The third phase, if necessary, would involve public disclosure of the evidence through tech industry publications and social media channels. The approach was designed to give Blake an opportunity to correct his misrepresentations voluntarily, while making clear that continued deception would result in public exposure and potential legal consequences. The strategy balanced my desire for justice with practical considerations about time, cost, and probability of success. Leaving David's office, I felt a mixture of determination and anxiety. The legal pathway was clearer now, but it would require courage to challenge someone with Blake's established reputation and resources. The tech industry could be unforgiving toward whistleblowers, especially when they challenged successful founders with venture capital backing. That afternoon, I met with Marcus Rodriguez, a freelance technology journalist who specialized in covering Seattle's startup ecosystem. Marcus had written several articles about StreamlineSync's success, and I'd reached out to him through LinkedIn with a vague request to discuss untold aspects of the StreamlineSync story. He'd agreed to meet at a neutral coffee shop, intrigued by the possibility of an exclusive angle on a story he'd already covered. Marcus was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 30s, with the intense curiosity of someone who'd built a career on uncovering hidden narratives in the tech world. He'd covered several high-profile cases of founder disputes and intellectual property controversies, giving him credibility when approaching sensitive stories about startup culture and attribution disputes. "I've been following StreamlineSync since their seed funding," Marcus said as we settled into a corner booth away from other customers. "Blake Morrison has built quite a reputation as a technical founder who understands creative industry needs. What untold aspects are we talking about?" I'd prepared carefully for this conversation, knowing that Marcus would need compelling evidence before considering publication of any story that challenged Blake's established narrative. I began by outlining my technical background and explaining my relationship with Blake, emphasizing the collaborative nature of our early discussions about project management software. Initially, I thought we were building something together, I explained. Blake had identified market needs based on his business background, and I had the technical skills to implement solutions. It seemed like a natural partnership. Marcus took notes as I described the development process, occasionally asking clarifying questions about technical details and timeline elements. His experience covering startup stories had taught him to identify credible sources and recognize the difference between legitimate grievances and disgruntled employee complaints. The conversation shifted when I showed him examples of my source code documentation and development notebooks. Marcus had enough technical background to recognize the sophistication of the architectural decisions and implementation details. The complexity of the code, combined with the detailed documentation of my thought process, painted a compelling picture of technical authorship. "This is significant," Marcus said, studying the GitHub repository on my laptop. "If you can prove that you wrote the core StreamlineSync codebase, it completely contradicts the narrative about Blake's role as technical founder." The venture capital community takes technical founding claims very seriously. We discussed the broader implications of the story beyond just my personal situation. Cases of technical contribution misattribution were surprisingly common in the startup world, particularly affecting women and underrepresented minorities, whose work was often marginalized or ignored entirely. My story could illuminate systemic problems and how the tech industry recognized and credited technical contributions. "The human interest angle is compelling," Marcus observed, "but I'd need independent verification of your technical claims before publication. Can you provide access to other developers who could review your code and confirm its sophistication?" I'd anticipated this requirement and had already reached out to several former colleagues from my time at the design agency. 2 senior developers had agreed to review my technical documentation and provide professional opinions about the complexity and quality of the work. Their assessments would carry weight as independent verification of my technical capabilities. Marcus and I agreed on a timeline for his investigation. He would need several weeks to verify my technical claims, interview other sources familiar with StreamlineSync's development, and potentially reach out to Blake for comment on my allegations. The story would be significant enough to warrant careful fact-checking and legal review before publication. "One thing I need to make clear," Marcus said as our meeting concluded, "is that this story will likely provoke a strong response from Blake and potentially from StreamlineSync's investors. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny and potential backlash?" The question was sobering but expected. Challenging a successful founder's narrative would inevitably create controversy and potentially damage Blake's reputation and company valuation. The consequences could extend beyond Blake himself to affect StreamlineSync's employees, investors, and customers. I needed to be certain that my desire for justice outweighed the potential collateral damage. "I understand the implications," I replied. "But I can't continue allowing someone else to take credit for my work while I remain invisible." The tech industry needs to address these attribution problems, and sometimes that requires individuals to speak up despite personal risks. Walking home from the meeting, I reflected on the momentum building around my decision to challenge Blake's narrative. The legal framework was in place, the evidence was documented, and media interest was confirmed. Each step forward made it harder to retreat, and easier to imagine a future where my contributions received proper recognition. That evening, I returned to my laptop and began composing a detailed technical analysis of StreamlineSync's architecture, implementation, and innovative features. The document would serve multiple purposes: supporting my legal claims, providing evidence for Marcus's journalistic investigation, and creating a comprehensive record of my technical contributions for public disclosure if necessary. The analysis grew to over 50 pages as I documented every significant aspect of StreamlineSync's development. Each feature description included technical specifications, implementation details, design rationale, and evidence of my authorship through code commits and development notes. The document painted a complete picture of the intellectual property that Blake had appropriated while positioning himself as its creator. Writing the analysis felt cathartic and empowering. For months, I'd been silently watching Blake claim credit for innovations I'd created through countless hours of research, development, and refinement. The technical document allowed me to reclaim ownership of my work while demonstrating the sophistication and creativity that Blake had been presenting as his own vision. The most challenging section focused on StreamlineSync's artificial intelligence features, particularly the machine learning algorithms that powered project timeline prediction and resource optimization recommendations. These features represented some of my most advanced technical work, requiring deep understanding of data science concepts, natural language processing, and predictive modeling techniques. Blake's public explanations of these AI features were consistently superficial, focusing on business benefits rather than technical implementation details. His descriptions often contained subtle inaccuracies that suggested limited understanding of how the algorithms actually functioned. Someone who had genuinely designed and implemented machine learning systems would be able to articulate the mathematical principles, training methodologies, and performance optimization techniques that made the features possible. I documented specific examples of Blake's technical misstatements during public presentations and media interviews, contrasting them with accurate descriptions of how the AI systems actually worked. The comparison would make it difficult for him to maintain claims of technical authorship when confronted with evidence of his limited understanding of his supposed innovations. By the time I finished writing the technical analysis, it was nearly 3 a.m. The document represented a comprehensive defense of my intellectual property claims, while serving as an indictment of Blake's systematic deception. Reading through the completed analysis, I felt proud of what I'd accomplished, and determined to ensure it received the recognition it deserved. The evidence was overwhelming, the legal strategy was clear, and the media pathway was established. Blake had underestimated the quiet barista who'd helped build his empire, assuming I would remain silent and invisible while he claimed glory for our collaborative work. He was about to discover how wrong he'd been about my willingness to fight for what was rightfully mine. The next phase would require courage, persistence, and strategic timing. But for the first time since discovering the full extent of Blake's deception, I felt confident that justice was possible. The truth about StreamlineSync's real creator was about to emerge, and no amount of venture capital funding or industry connections would be able to suppress it. 2 weeks later, I stood outside the Seattle Convention Center, where TechCrunch Disrupt was hosting its annual Pacific Northwest Startup Showcase. Blake was scheduled to deliver a keynote presentation about the future of creative project management at 2 o'clock, speaking to an audience of investors, entrepreneurs, and technology journalists. The irony wasn't lost on me that he would be discussing the future of technology I'd actually created while I remained completely absent from the narrative. The timing was perfect for multiple reasons. Marcus Rodriguez had completed his investigation and was ready to publish his exposé the following morning. David Chen had filed my copyright registrations and prepared cease and desist documentation. Most importantly, Blake would be speaking to the exact audience that needed to hear the truth about StreamlineSync's real origins. I'd spent the previous night preparing for what would either be the most empowering or most professionally destructive moment of my career. The technical analysis document was loaded on my laptop, ready for immediate distribution. Screenshots of source code commits, development notebooks, and email communications were organized in a presentation that would systematically dismantle Blake's claims of technical authorship. The evidence was irrefutable, but presenting it publicly would cross a line from which there would be no return. Emma had given me the day off from grind coffee, understanding that I was handling something important without needing specific details. Her support over the past weeks had been invaluable, providing both practical assistance and emotional encouragement as I prepared to challenge Blake's narrative. She'd even offered to attend the presentation as moral support, though I declined, wanting to handle the confrontation independently. The convention center lobby buzzed with the familiar energy of tech industry events. Attendees clustered around sponsor booths, networking over coffee while discussing the latest funding rounds and product launches. The Startup Showcase attracted Seattle's most influential technology leaders, creating an environment where reputations could be made or destroyed in a single presentation. I purchased a day pass and made my way to the main auditorium where Blake's keynote would take place. The venue was impressive, with professional lighting and multiple camera angles that would stream the presentation live to thousands of online viewers. Whatever happened during the next hour would be recorded and widely distributed, amplifying the impact of any revelations that emerged. Blake appeared on stage precisely at 2 o'clock, looking polished and confident in an expensive suit that projected the image of a successful technical founder. His presentation slides featured the familiar StreamlineSync branding and user interface screenshots that showcased features I'd designed and implemented. The disconnect between his public persona and the reality of his technical limitations was striking when viewed with complete knowledge of the truth. Creative teams face unique project management challenges that traditional software solutions simply can't address, Blake began, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. When I founded StreamlineSync, I recognized that creative professionals needed tools designed specifically for their iterative, collaborative workflows. The audience listened attentively as Blake outlined the market opportunity and competitive landscape. His business analysis was competent, reflecting genuine understanding of creative industry needs and project management pain points. This had always been his legitimate strength, the ability to identify market gaps and articulate business strategies. The problem was his complete fabrication of the technical story that followed. The breakthrough came when I realized that traditional project management assumes linear workflows, but creative work is inherently cyclical and iterative, Blake continued, advancing to slides that displayed StreamlineSync's user interface. I designed an architecture that could accommodate multiple concurrent creative processes while maintaining clear visibility into project status and resource allocation. Every word was a lie built on my innovations. The architectural insights he was claiming had emerged from my analysis of creative team workflows during late-night development sessions in my apartment. The user interface design reflected months of research into visual hierarchy and information architecture principles. The technical implementation had required sophisticated understanding of real-time data synchronization and conflict resolution algorithms. Blake's presentation moved into a demonstration of StreamlineSync's advanced features, particularly the AI-powered timeline prediction and resource optimization tools. He spoke confidently about machine learning applications and predictive analytics, using terminology that sounded impressive to audiences unfamiliar with the technical complexity involved. But his explanations remained consistently superficial, focusing on business benefits rather than implementation details. The artificial intelligence components learn from historical project data to predict potential delays and resource conflicts before they impact deliverable timelines, Blake explained, displaying charts and graphs that visualized the AI feature's performance. This predictive capability transforms project management from reactive problem-solving to proactive optimization. I'd heard him give similar explanations before, but viewing them now with complete knowledge of his deception made the performance almost surreal. He was describing machine learning systems I'd built while presenting himself as their creator. The algorithms he was discussing had required months of research into natural language processing, statistical modeling, and performance optimization techniques that Blake couldn't possibly understand at the level necessary for implementation. During the question and answer session that followed his presentation, several audience members asked technical questions about StreamlineSync's architecture and development process. Blake handled these inquiries with practiced evasion, redirecting technical questions toward business strategy and market positioning. When pressed for specific implementation details, he claimed proprietary concerns prevented detailed technical disclosure. One particularly insightful question came from a software engineer in the audience, who asked about the operational transformation algorithms that enabled real-time collaboration. Blake's response was vague and conceptually incorrect, demonstrating fundamental misunderstanding of the mathematical principles involved. Anyone with expertise in distributed systems would recognize that his explanation didn't align with how real-time collaboration actually functioned. As the formal presentation concluded and Blake prepared to leave the stage, I stood up from my seat in the middle of the auditorium. The movement caught Blake's attention, and I watched his expression shift from professional satisfaction to surprise, and then to something approaching alarm. He recognized me immediately, understanding that my presence at his keynote presentation was neither coincidental nor supportive. "I have a question about the technical development process," I called out, my voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. Specifically about who actually wrote the source code for StreamlineSync's core functionality. The audience turned to look at me with interest, expecting a routine technical inquiry from another developer. Blake's face had gone pale, but he maintained his composure, apparently hoping he could deflect the question as he had others. "I appreciate your interest in our development process," Blake replied carefully. "But as I mentioned, detailed technical implementation involves proprietary methodologies that we prefer not to discuss publicly." I pulled out my laptop and opened the technical analysis document I'd prepared, then began walking toward the front of the auditorium. The unconventional behavior drew murmurs from the audience, but the venue security seemed unsure whether to intervene in what appeared to be an extended question-and-answer exchange. "That's interesting," I continued, "because I have extensive documentation proving that I wrote the vast majority of StreamlineSync's source code, designed its user interface, and implemented its AI features. Would you like to explain how you claim authorship of work you didn't actually create?" The auditorium fell silent as the implications of my statement became clear. This wasn't a routine technical question. It was a public accusation of intellectual property theft directed at a prominent startup founder. Blake's expression cycled through confusion, anger, and calculation as he tried to formulate a response that wouldn't further incriminate him. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," Blake said, his voice strained but still attempting to project authority. "Maya helped with some early development tasks, but the core innovation and technical architecture of StreamlineSync reflects my vision and leadership." I reached the front of the auditorium and connected my laptop to the presentation system that Blake had been using. The technical analysis document appeared on the large screens, displaying detailed source code excerpts, commit histories, and architectural diagrams that documented my comprehensive role in StreamlineSync's creation. "This is the GitHub repository containing StreamlineSync's original source code," I announced, advancing through slides that showed commit timestamps and technical implementation details. Every major feature, every algorithmic innovation, every user interface element was implemented during late-night coding sessions at my apartment, while Blake attended networking events and investor meetings. The audience was transfixed as I systematically presented evidence of my technical contributions. The source code documentation was undeniable, showing sophisticated implementation of complex features that required deep technical expertise. The commit history painted a clear picture of months spent building the platform, while Blake contributed business strategy and market analysis. The machine learning algorithms that Blake just described as his breakthrough innovation were implemented using TensorFlow and scikit-learn libraries, requiring statistical modeling expertise that can be verified through the mathematical complexity of the code itself. I continued, displaying specific algorithmic implementations. Someone who actually designed these systems would be able to explain the mathematical principles behind collaborative filtering and predictive modeling techniques. Blake stood frozen at the side of the stage, apparently calculating whether to attempt further denial or to acknowledge some version of the truth. The evidence I was presenting was too comprehensive and technically detailed for simple dismissal, but admitting the scope of his deception would destroy his reputation and potentially trigger legal consequences. Members of the audience began pulling out phones to photograph the technical documentation appearing on screen. The live stream was capturing everything, ensuring that this confrontation would be preserved and widely distributed throughout the tech community. Blake's carefully constructed narrative about his role as technical founder was collapsing in real time before hundreds of witnesses. The user interface design that Blake claims reflects his understanding of creative workflows actually emerged from my research into visual hierarchy and information architecture principles, I said, advancing to slides that showed my original wireframes and design specifications. These mock-ups were created months before Blake's first investor presentation, contradicting his timeline claims about when different features were conceived. The design documentation was particularly damning because it included handwritten notes and revision marks that showed my creative process. The wireframes progressed from simple concept sketches to detailed interface specifications, demonstrating the iterative design thinking that had produced StreamlineSync's intuitive user experience. Blake's business presentations had consistently post-dated my design work by weeks or months. I could see venture capitalists and technology journalists in the audience, taking detailed notes and photographs. The story unfolding on stage would likely appear in multiple publications within hours, spreading throughout the startup ecosystem and permanently altering Blake's professional reputation. The consequences of his deception were beginning to manifest in real time. The most damaging evidence, I continued, is the pattern of email communications where Blake consistently asked me to explain technical concepts and implementation details. Someone who had actually architected these systems wouldn't need explanations of how they functioned. I displayed selected email excerpts that showed Blake's questions about technical functionality, his requests for clarification about algorithmic performance, and his apparent confusion about implementation details. The communications painted a clear picture of someone who understood business strategy but lacked the technical knowledge necessary for actual development work. The audience was now openly discussing what they were witnessing, with clear recognition that this was a significant exposé of intellectual property theft, rather than a misunderstanding about collaboration credit. Several attendees were live tweeting the presentation, ensuring that news of Blake's deception would spread throughout the tech community within minutes. Blake finally stepped forward, apparently deciding that some form of response was necessary. His confident demeanor had completely evaporated, replaced by the defensive posture of someone whose carefully constructed facade was crumbling publicly. Maya made important contributions to StreamlineSync's development, he said, his voice lacking its earlier authority. But the vision, the business strategy, the market positioning, all of that represents my leadership and entrepreneurial insight. Technical implementation is just one component of building a successful startup. The response was simultaneously an admission and an attempt to minimize the significance of my contributions. By acknowledging that I'd handled technical implementation, Blake was essentially confirming that he hadn't actually built what he'd been claiming credit for creating. But his framing suggested that technical work was somehow less valuable than business strategy. Technical implementation isn't just one component, I replied, my voice carrying new confidence as I realized the audience was completely engaged with the evidence I was presenting. It's the entire product. Without the source code, the algorithms, the user interface, and the system architecture, StreamlineSync would be nothing more than a business plan and some PowerPoint slides. The audience murmured agreement with my assessment. In the tech industry, successful products required both business strategy and technical execution, but claiming credit for technical work you didn't perform was considered one of the most serious professional offenses possible. Blake had crossed a line that the startup community took extremely seriously. I advanced to the final section of my presentation, which included independent verification of my technical claims from respected software engineers who had reviewed my code and confirmed its sophistication. Their professional assessments carried significant weight, providing third-party validation of the technical complexity that Blake couldn't possibly have achieved without deep programming expertise. The evidence is comprehensive and independently verified, I concluded. Blake Morrison did not write the source code for StreamlineSync. He did not design its user interface. He did not implement its AI features. He appropriated my work and presented it as his own innovation to investors and the media. The auditorium erupted in conversations as attendees processed the implications of what they'd witnessed. This wasn't just a dispute about credit attribution. It was a complete exposé of fraudulent claims made to investors who had provided millions in funding based on Blake's misrepresented technical credentials. Blake made one final attempt to salvage his position, stepping closer to the microphone with an expression that mixed desperation with calculation. "This is a disgruntled former collaborator trying to rewrite history," he said, his voice carrying a note of practiced dismissiveness. "Maya worked as a contractor on some technical tasks, but the intellectual property and innovation behind StreamlineSync belongs to the company and its founders." The response was revealing in its legal implications. By describing me as a, quote, contractor on technical tasks, Blake was inadvertently admitting that he hadn't performed the technical work himself. But his claim about intellectual property ownership would be easily disproven by the copyright documentation that David Chen had filed on my behalf. I have filed copyright registrations for the StreamlineSync source code with the United States Copyright Office, I announced, producing the official documentation. The registrations establish my authorship of the technical work and provide legal protection against unauthorized use of my intellectual property. The copyright registrations represented the most serious escalation of the conflict. This was no longer just a public dispute about credit attribution. It was a formal legal claim with potential implications for StreamlineSync's investors, employees, and customers. The venture capital firms that had funded Blake's company based on his technical founder narrative would need to reassess their investments. As I gathered my materials and prepared to leave the stage, several audience members approached with business cards and questions about my technical background. The presentation had successfully established my credibility as the real technical founder, while exposing Blake's deception to the exact community that needed to understand the truth. Marcus Rodriguez was among the first to reach me, confirming that his article would be published the following morning with additional context from the live presentation. The story would include independent verification of my technical claims, along with analysis of the broader implications for startup founder accountability and intellectual property protection. This is going to be significant, Marcus said quietly, as we moved away from the main crowd. The venture capital community takes founder misrepresentation very seriously, especially when it involves technical credentials. Blake's going to face serious consequences beyond just reputational damage. Several investors from the audience were already making phone calls, likely contacting their firms to discuss the implications of Blake's exposed deception. StreamlineSync's Series B funding round, which had been scheduled to close within weeks, would almost certainly be suspended pending investigation of the intellectual property claims. As I left the convention center, my phone began buzzing with notifications from LinkedIn, Twitter, and email. Word of the presentation was spreading rapidly through technology networks, with attendees sharing photos and videos of the evidence I'd presented. The hashtag StreamlineSyncTruth was already trending among Seattle tech professionals. The most satisfying message came from Jessica, my patent attorney neighbor, who had watched the live stream online. "That was absolutely brilliant," she texted. "You couldn't have chosen a better venue or more compelling evidence. Blake's going to have a very difficult time recovering from this." By evening, the story had been picked up by multiple technology publications beyond Marcus's initial article. TechCrunch, GeekWire, and The Information had all published pieces about the presentation, with detailed analysis of the intellectual property implications and broader questions about founder accountability in the startup ecosystem. The response from the technology community was overwhelmingly supportive of my decision to expose Blake's deception. Comments on social media praised my courage in challenging a well-funded founder despite the personal and professional risks involved. Many people shared similar stories of technical contributors whose work had been marginalized or appropriated by more visible colleagues. The most significant development came 3 days later, when StreamlineSync's board of directors announced that Blake Morrison had been removed as CEO pending investigation of intellectual property claims. The company's venture capital investors had conducted an emergency review of the technical foundation underlying their investment, discovering that Blake's technical founder credentials had been completely fabricated. David Chen called to inform me that StreamlineSync's legal counsel had reached out to discuss potential resolution of my copyright claims. The company was apparently interested in negotiating acknowledgement of my contributions, along with financial compensation that would reflect my role as the platform's primary technical creator. "They're in a very difficult position," David explained. Their entire investment thesis was based on Blake's technical founder narrative, and now they've discovered that their core intellectual property was created by someone who has no formal relationship with the company. They need to resolve this quickly to preserve any hope of completing their funding round. The negotiation process took several weeks but ultimately resulted in an agreement that exceeded my most optimistic expectations. StreamlineSync formally acknowledged my role as the platform's technical co-founder, granted me significant equity in the company, and provided financial compensation for my years of unrecognized contributions. Most importantly, the company agreed to publicly correct the narrative about StreamlineSync's development and ensure that my technical innovations received proper attribution. Blake Morrison disappeared from the Seattle tech scene entirely following his termination from StreamlineSync. Reports suggested that he was facing potential legal action from investors who had provided funding based on his misrepresented credentials. The venture capital firms that had backed him were conducting comprehensive reviews of their due diligence processes to prevent similar founder misrepresentation in future investments. 6 months later, I stood on the stage at the same Seattle Convention Center where I had exposed Blake's deception, But this time, I was delivering my own keynote presentation about technical innovation in creative project management software. StreamlineSync had continued to grow under new leadership, with my technical vision finally receiving the recognition it deserved. The transformation felt surreal, but deeply satisfying. I'd gone from being an invisible barista whose technical contributions were systematically erased, to being recognized as one of Seattle's most innovative software architects. The tech community's response to my story had opened doors I'd never imagined, with multiple companies offering senior technical positions and investment opportunities for my future projects. Emma had attended my keynote presentation, beaming with pride as I described the technical challenges involved in building real-time collaboration systems for creative teams. After the presentation, she approached with a characteristically direct observation. "You know what the best part of this whole story is?" she said, grinning broadly. "Blake spent months treating you like you were just a barista, never realizing that the barista was actually smarter than he was. The irony was perfect and poetic. Blake had systematically underestimated me based on my day job, assuming that someone who worked in a coffee shop couldn't possibly possess the technical sophistication necessary to build complex software systems. His condescension had blinded him to the reality that he was living with and dating the very technical genius whose work he was appropriating. I'd returned to work at Grind Coffee briefly after resolving the StreamlineSync situation, partly out of loyalty to Emma, and partly because I genuinely enjoyed the customer service aspects of the job. But my recognition in the tech community had led to consulting opportunities and speaking engagements that made continuing as a barista impractical. The Reynolds Recovery Foundation that I established used part of my StreamlineSync settlement to support other technical contributors whose work had been marginalized or appropriated. The foundation provided legal assistance, publicity support, and financial resources to help people challenge attribution theft and intellectual property misappropriation. Stories began emerging from across the tech industry about similar cases of technical work being credited to more visible colleagues, particularly affecting women and underrepresented minorities, whose contributions were often minimized or ignored entirely. My public confrontation with Blake had apparently inspired others to speak up about their own experiences with attribution theft. The most rewarding aspect of the Foundation's work was seeing other technical innovators receive recognition for their contributions. Each case we supported represented someone whose creativity and expertise had been stolen by colleagues who understood how to manipulate credit attribution for personal gain. Helping these individuals reclaim their professional identities felt like extending the justice I'd achieved in my own situation. During a recent Foundation event, a young software engineer approached me with a story that sounded remarkably familiar. She'd been collaborating with a startup founder, who claimed her technical innovations as his own vision, while positioning himself as the company's technical leader. The pattern was identical to what I'd experienced with Blake, confirming that intellectual property appropriation was a systemic problem requiring ongoing attention and advocacy. "The hardest part," she explained, "is that people assume the person giving presentations and talking to investors must be the one who actually built the technology. It's so easy for technical contributors to become invisible while someone else takes credit for their work." Her observation perfectly captured the challenge I'd faced with Blake. The tech industry's focus on charismatic founders and compelling narratives often obscured the reality that complex technical products required sophisticated engineering expertise that couldn't be faked or summarized in PowerPoint presentations. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that Blake's betrayal had inadvertently liberated me from limiting beliefs about my own capabilities and potential. His systematic appropriation of my work had forced me to document and articulate my technical innovations in ways that revealed their true sophistication and market value. The woman he'd dismissed as, quote, just a barista, had actually been one of Seattle's most innovative software architects, building technology that would transform how creative teams managed complex projects. His condescension had blinded him to the reality that he was stealing from someone whose technical abilities far exceeded his own understanding. The final irony was that Blake's attempt to erase me from the StreamlineSync story had ultimately backfired spectacularly. By forcing me to prove my contributions publicly, he'd inadvertently created a platform for demonstrating technical expertise that established my reputation throughout the industry. His deception had become the catalyst for my professional transformation, From invisible contributor to recognized innovator, the tech industry had learned important lessons about founder accountability and intellectual property protection from the StreamlineSync case. Venture capital firms now conducted more thorough technical due diligence, and startup communities were more vigilant about attribution theft and technical misrepresentation. But the most important lesson was personal. Technical innovation deserved recognition regardless of who created it or what their day job happened to be. The quiet barista crafting perfect lattes might also be the brilliant software architect building the next generation of collaborative technology. Underestimating people based on superficial assumptions could result in missing the most important contributors to any technical innovation. Blake Morrison had learned this lesson too late to save his career or reputation. The man who'd treated his girlfriend like an accessory to his success had discovered that she was actually the foundation upon which his entire empire had been built. When that foundation shifted, everything he'd constructed on top of it had collapsed. The balance of power had shifted permanently and irreversibly. While Blake faced the consequences of his systematic deception, I was building new technological innovations and helping other creators protect their intellectual property. The future belonged to authentic technical contributors rather than charismatic appropriators, and I was determined to help ensure that recognition went to the people who actually earned it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.